laws in our state include and protect our community. So that's what we do. So I'm just wondering, just curious, how well do you think LGBTQ rights advance in a legislature that is comprised of, I would think, 90% Latter-day Saints and 80% Republicans? How well do you think we do? What? Are you doubting? Are you doubting our ability to do things? The truth is that in comparison to other red states across the country, Texas, Kentucky, Alabama, Georgia, North Carolina, we are doing phenomenally well. Over the past 5 years, we've had 4 major initiatives that we've advanced through the Utah legislature that's arrived on Governor Herbert's desk that he has signed and supported. And so we are really grateful to the state of Utah that is very conservative, that have very strong conservative, so-called traditional values, have been willing to sit down and work with the LGBTQ community. And I think that speaks to the goodness of the people of Utah. There is a willingness to sit down and engage with people. We see it on LGBT issues, we see it on immigrant rights issues, we see that Utahns as a whole are kind and compassionate and loving. And we have different points of view, but we have creative ways of working through our problems. So I'll give you a little bit of a background for me. This is like ages ago, this is like, 30 years ago, I came home from my Mormon mission. I was in England, and I was so scared that I was going to be gay, because it was like inside of me. It was like this is nascent thing that was like trying to get out, and I was a big Madonna fan. I mean, all of the early signs were there from early age, and this thing was like was trying to claw out of me, and I was so scared that if I came out, I'd lose everything. I'd lose my family, I'd lose my friends, I'd lose my church, I'd lose everything. So I ran to the thing that was farthest from. I started volunteering as an intern for the Utah Eagle Forum. So you maybe have heard of Gail Ruzicka, and she is the leading anti-gay advocate here up on Capitol Hill. And she was my mentor. The first time I ever came to this building was actually with Gail, and she took me on the tour. She actually taught me how to be a lobbyist. She taught me how to approach lawmakers, how you actually move a bill from rules through committees, and then to the House, and then to the Senate, and then to the governor's desk. She taught me how to testify in committee hearings. And so today I want to give my gratitude and my respect, because all of the success that Equality Utah has had over the past years, we can trace right back to Gail Ruzicka and the Utah Eagle Forum. So I was a little intern, I was a little eaglet, and it was my way, I think, of sublimating my sexuality, because I was so afraid of this is 30 years ago, so the world was very different, right? And one of Gail's signature pieces of legislation that she passed here in 1997 was a prohibition for public school teachers to even talk about gay issues in the classroom. It was a prohibition on the advocacy of homosexuality. It sounds very ominous, because the homosexuals have this agenda to corrupt young children, and so we couldn't allow them to recruit in public schools. That's what Gail famously said in the New York Times. And so we call this like the no promo homo law. I'll come back to that in a little bit. I grew up in Eugene, Oregon, so it's very sort of hippie town, love the Grateful Dead, they're all smoking weed, and that's what, the very liberal sort of earth goddess kind of energy healers and crystals, and that was always sort of around me, and so it kind of kicked in, and then I was able to eventually come out, and then I had to make amends. I had to make amends for being this right-wing activist, and I started working at KRCL Radio, 90.9 FM, and I worked there for 10 years and produced a talk show on social justice called Radioactive. It's still on the air. It airs at 6 p.m. every weeknight. And finally, and then at that time I started organizing, and I just started doing rallies and protests up at the Capitol, because there was always something going on. There was always some piece of legislation, and the whole marriage equality battle. There was always something to get us all agitated and worked up, and so I got pretty good at like making a ruckus, you know, and we would do kiss-ins on things. We'd have kiss-ins downtown on Temple Square, and we'd do protests up here at the Capitol, and we'd have a good old time. I always believed activism should be fun, right? I always believed that you should be joyful in it as well. You can agitate, of course, but you always want to have fun, because there's that famous anarchist, Emma Goldman, who said, if you don't dance, I don't want to be part of your revolution, right? Right, and so this is the thing, you have to have a little bit of joy in your movement, right? I mean, if you're just all somber and angry all the time, no one wants to come on board and help you out, right? You want to have some fun with this. So I always tried to have fun with our movement. I think that's one of the reasons why the LGBT movement has had such tremendous success across the country, because we always try to build allies. You know, we can't do this alone. There's not enough of us. We need you at our side. And it's a lot more fun when we have victories to have you there for the party afterward, right? Okay, we need to make sure that we're all in this together, and recognizing that we need your help and you need our help too, because all of these social issues, whether we're talking about women's rights or racial equity or racial justice, disability rights, all of these issues are all connected. And when one group advances, we all advance together. And so we have to make sure that we are there fighting alongside each other and for each other. So, about 20, I think it was 2013, Utah was the first state in the nation to overturn a marriage ban in December of 2013. Can you believe that? Utah, the first state in the country to overturn a gay marriage ban. And that started the domino procession, state by state by state by state. And at that time, Equality Utah, I was not the director yet, so I was still over at KRCL. But we were trying to just get a non-discrimination law passed. It was just non-discrimination for LGBT people in employment and housing. So you just couldn't be fired or evicted for being gay or transgender. And we had tried so much, and we hit a wall every single year, and we finally realized, well, wait a minute, if there's 80% of the body is Republicans, maybe we should start having Republicans run our bills. I mean, we love our Democrat allies because they've always been there for us, but to move it through a Republican body, let's get some Republican allies. You know, the Dems are with us. Let's see if we can, you know, recruit some people from the Republican Party to help us out. And Senator Steve Urquhart decided, he was like the first one to come forward and say, he was like from rural St. George area, and he was like, I'm going to be on board to help you pass this. But we hit roadblock after roadblock every single year, and then after the marriage, after the whole marriage thing happened in Utah, well, there was this fear, I think, amongst the governor and some folks that Utah's law, Kitchen v. Herbert, might be the one that went all the way to the Supreme Court and brought marriage equality to everybody. And so they put this moratorium on all LGBT-related bills on January of 2014. But they did it without asking us or saying we're going to do this. They just did it, and it kind of blocked us out of the legislative process. And so, independent of Equality Utah at that point, I gathered some of my friends, and we just held this big protest, and we sat in and blocked the doors to Governor Herbert's office. And what I didn't know is that he had secret passages out the back ways, and so they all like evacuated because, oh, here come the queers, and they're all locked in there, and it was very scary for some people. And Gail Ruzicka put this action alert out, my old mentor, say the homosexuals are at it again. They're protesting outside of Governor Herbert's desk and getting everyone all worked up, and so they evacuated the governor, and so I'm like, okay, what are we gonna do next? And we realized where the president of the Senate was going to be, Niederhauser. And so we moved our operation after lunch there to block the doors, and that's when the state troopers came in and they hauled us away, and I spent the next 9 hours in the county jail, and they separated me from the rest of my crew. There was 13 of us, it was called the Capital 13. They separated me from the crew and put me in the drunk tank by myself with 3 intoxicated homeless people, and so I think they're trying to make a message there, but you know, civil disobedience, that has its place in time, and we were able to keep the dialogue going. But then Equality Utah's executive director decides to take a job out of state, and the position comes open. And everyone's like, and I'm like, I don't want, can I do this? Can I stop being this rabble rouser and put on a tie and a jacket and be respectable? I'm gonna give it a try, because it's really easy when you're on talk radio, right? Because you can say whatever you want to say on the radio. But then when you actually are up here and you want to move a piece of legislation through a body of, mostly dudes, who are 80% Republican, how on earth are you going to pull that off as this kind of crazy lefty, queer activist? And so it was a real interesting time for me to sort of sit back and go, well, how do you do this, right? I've been doing rallies and protests saying this is an injustice, but how do we actually do it? And the great thing that happened in my first legislative session, which was in 2015, the LDS Church, seeing this culture war and this divide and all this tension that had been going on for years, said, hey, Equality Utah, let's work together and figure this out. And so we sat down and I was like, okay, and I think everyone was a little bit suspicious of each other, right? I mean, I think the church was like, okay, they got this crazy kid in there now, and as the head of Equality Utah, and I'm looking at them going, now what are your intentions here really, right? And it was this big leap of faith, I think, for all sides. And we brought together this amazing roundtable of folks, the church, Equality Utah, Democrat leadership, Republican leadership, and we said, there's a lot of things that we don't agree on ideologically. For example, we don't agree on marriage, but what do we agree on? That was the question that we had to keep coming back to. What do we agree on? And we ultimately agreed that people shouldn't be fired from their jobs or evicted from their homes based on their sexual orientation, their gender identity, or their religious beliefs. And we're like, yeah, we agree with that. And so we had this, what was called in the press the Utah Compromise. I never liked that name because I don't like the idea of compromising values, but I think it is good, to recognize that sometimes there is give and take in a democracy, right? When you have competing interests and competing factions, all wanting to take part in the beauty of the potential of the American dream, right? And so we worked together and we passed this law, and it was a turning point for the state. It was the first time in our country's history when LGBT legislation was passed through a Republican-controlled legislature. Hadn't happened before, hasn't happened since, except in Utah. Okay, so remember Gail's no promo homo law, all right, passed in 1997. Now her young acolyte, her young student, is now the head of Equality Utah. She's still up here. She's still up here advocating against our rights and liberties. And so we initially filed a lawsuit against the State Board of Education to overturn the no promo homo law, and the Utah legislature jumped to intervene. And I worked with President Adams, and we passed a bill to repeal that law, and it was passed in the House with only one dissenting vote, and it was passed in the Senate with only one dissenting vote. And those two lawmakers aren't here anymore who voted against us. But that shows you, I mean, we liberalized the sex education laws in Utah with this Utah legislature, all right? So this is like, only one other state in the country had ever repealed a no promo homo law, and that was that conservative bastion of California, right? So Utah did this again, and again, so often it's because lawmakers are willing to sit down with parents and who have kids and hear their stories. And I don't know what it is about Utah, but Utahns, and Mormons in particular, have lots of gay and trans babies, okay? We keep cranking them out, all right? And I'm evidence of that, all right? I don't know what it is, but, we've got to find common ground, and there is no more common ground than what Mormons and gays have. Like we all love our parades, right? We love pageants, okay? We love musical theater and we love ballroom dancing, right? Now even at BYU is having same-sex couples can compete, with ballroom dancing now. So yeah, so you'd think that we are on all these ideological differences about things, but really when it comes down to it, we have more in common than we have apart. So it's really about learning how to focus on those things that connect us together. We don't have to agree on everything, right? But we do agree that families should stay intact, right? We do agree that we don't want to lose kids to suicide. We do agree that this state is better when we're all elevated. And so it's really, I'm so proud of the Utah legislature for their willingness to open their hearts to us. And I think that's really what's created so much change, is that we've been willing to talk heart to heart to people. Because what I've learned over time is that facts don't change people's minds. Usually we just dig in, right, when we have an argument on Facebook with our uncle, and we're having some debate over Trump or over healthcare, and everyone just kind of digs in to their opinions, and no one considers another point of view unless you have a relationship with them. And then when they are your friend or they are your family member and you open your heart to them, then they're more willing to consider a point of view. And I see it time and time again up here on Capitol Hill. Super conservative lawmakers who are stepping up to support our work. Last session, we passed an LGBTQ inclusive hate crimes law. And we did it by building a tremendous coalition. We were working alongside the NAACP, the ADL. We were working along with different faith organizations, criminal justice organizations, because we all agreed that no one should be targeted for violence because of who they are. And so we had this big coalition. It took us quite a long years. It took the efforts to pass an LGBT inclusive hate crimes law, or a real hate crime statute, have been going on up here for over 20 years. And lawmakers were always afraid, well, if you enumerate the categories and you put race and religion and sexual orientation in there, then if we do that, this is 20 years ago, if we put sexual orientation into our hate crimes law, then someday they're going to want to get married. Right? And so that was the big argument that prevented hate crimes from moving forward. And then we got marriage equality without hate crimes, right? And so this argument that they always use, we're like, well, this kind of issue is over, so can we move this forward? And we did last year. And it took us, we just about 4 years, and Senator Dan Thatcher and Representative Lee Perry are the ones that sponsored that bill. 2 Republicans, 2 Latter-day Saints, and they really took up the mantle and the banner, and they really pushed this through and brought their conservative colleagues along on this issue. So huge success. And then last year as well, we were really struggling as an organization, as a community, to wrap our minds around this suicide epidemic in our state. Suicide is the leading cause of death for young people in Utah. All right, and over the past decade, suicide rates for young people have spiked 141%. And we're all like, why is this happening? And we don't have the breakdown of how many of that number is LGBT, because we don't actually track the data in the state yet. But we know that young people who identify as such are often targeted for bullying and often have high risk factors that include suicide. And we know from national data that young people, LGBT people, have higher rates of suicide. So we're trying to figure out, what can we do? How can we contribute to this as a public policy organization? And the issue that kept coming up for us time and time again was the issue of conversion therapy. It's not really a therapy, all right? It's a practice because it's been discredited by every medical and mental health organization in the country. And so we wanted to put a ban on conversion therapy for minors, and we introduced it last February. with two conservative lawmakers again, Representative Craig Hall and Senator Dan McKay. And we went and sat down with leaders of the LDS Church, and we started the dialogue there, because the church had a history of practicing and sending kids to conversion therapy. And we were very pleased that they were willing to work with us. And they had themselves moved away from the practice of conversion therapy and had repudiated it, and so we knew that there was room for us to work. So we started the process, and we had our press conference. Everything's moving forward. We were telling the stories of conversion therapy survivors, and the data was coming out. Kind of really synced up. The release of this data synced up with our campaign and our effort, and we began to see that when young people were subjected to conversion therapy practices, their rates of depression doubled, and their attempts at suicide tripled. So there we had it. So we knew that the state of Utah could do something really significant. 18 other states had passed bans on conversion therapy. So we introduced the bill, and my old mentor just was fuming over it. In fact, she's still mad at me today over this. And there's just a blind spot. I have a special affection for Gail over this issue, but she's wrong about this issue. She's wrong about all issues related to the LGBT community. And she always likes to say that God is guiding her, but I always like to tell her that when it comes to LGBT issues, God is on our side. So she began aggressively lobbying against our efforts to protect kids. And she brought in all of these old conversion therapists. They crawled out of the 1980s and 90s and showed up to testify. It was a very harrowing session last year, because we would have conversion therapy survivors in public hearings testifying about their experience. And at one point, one of our survivors named Arturo, he was testifying about his experience, and he said, and here is my conversion therapist right here, waiting to testify after me. So it was this really difficult thing. And at one point, one of the representatives was successful working with Gail to hijack the bill and rewrite it in a manner that actually protected conversion therapists. So Representative Hall and Senator McKay, we pulled the bill. These awesome student activists from the University of Utah came in and did a big sit-in right in front of Governor Herbert's doors, where I had been arrested years before. And Governor Herbert, seeing what had happened, responded with an apology and a solution. He knew that this issue was so polarizing that he said we need science to prevail over politics. And so he gave a task to the Board of Psychologists who govern the licenses of therapists, and he had them, from a scientific point of view, draft a regulation to ban conversion therapy. As of Wednesday of last week, conversion therapy is banned in the state of Utah. We are the 19th state in the country to do so, and by far the most conservative. So we're kicking ass here in Utah, and it's because of, I'm so grateful to Governor Herbert. I'm so grateful for legislators who have been willing to open their hearts to us and to engage with our community, and so I'm hopeful. This year we've got Gail's back with some bills that are really targeting transgender youth, a bill to exclude trans kids from participating in sports in high schools, and also a bill that would prevent them from having access to life-saving medical care. So, yeah.
You want to take maybe 5 minutes?
Yep.
Question?
Yep. So anyway, I'm just going to say finally about those bills. They're not going to pass. All right. We're done letting kids be the political pawns of yesterday's culture wars. That's done. So I'm so grateful that Gail trained me to defeat her bills. So yeah. So go ahead. I'm here to answer your questions. Yes.
In Park City, in the Park City School District, there's been controversy about a welcome.
Yep. 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 Absolutely. Yeah. The question was about Park City and welcoming schools. So when we resolved the lawsuit over the No Promo Homo law, we came in and started working with the State Board of Education to draft anti-bullying policies and procedures to really protect not just LGBT kids, but kids of color, kids with different religions and levels of ability. And we have, with Equity Advisory Committee with the school board, have drafted really strong protections for LGBT students. And one of the elected state school board members, Scott Hansen, has proposed gutting all of those protections. And a lot of that is in response to this what's called the Welcoming Schools curriculum. And so we're talking with Scott Hansen, and we're meeting with him next week, and we're going to really make the case that we cannot weaken protections for LGBT students. We know that when states enumerate protections with anti-bullying rules, rates of bullying drop across the country. So we're going to make that case to him, and we're going to protect kids in our public schools still. So, yeah. Yes?
So first of all, thank you for being here.
Yeah.
For what you did.
Thank
so
you.
Important. Wasatch County, they did a Sharps survey presentation, and they talked about how, I think this is either the first year or the second year, they had a question on there.
Yeah.
Where kids could identify as LGBTQ,
Right.
And of those kids who checked that box, that 50% of them had contemplated suicide or written a plan or felt isolated.
Yeah.
And so Lieutenant Governor Cox had said how they have a big initiative, a mental health initiative that they're pushing forward, and I was wondering how you're involved in that.
Yeah, so the Sharp survey has been something we've been working on for several years, and that's the Student Health Risk Assessment Survey, and the state, and this is the power of the Utah Eagle Forum, they've really prevented us actually getting data on sexual orientation and gender identity in public schools, because the idea is that if a kid marks that they're gay, that somehow they're going to be gay. Right, and so because we can't, unless we have the data that we need, we can't actually craft programs that actually help and make things better. And now we have the first year we're starting to collect data. I'm sure it'll take a couple of years for us to really get a real a survey of what's really happening. But we're on the path to it now. And now that we know, when we know better, we can do better. And because we have these questions now, I think it's going to make this work a lot easier for us. Yeah.
Maybe one more question? No?
All right.
Thank you.